The hearing room didn't look like the scene of an economic collapse. It was all polished mahogany tables and bottled water lined up like trophies. But the second Jasmine Crockett walked in, files tucked tight under her arm, you could feel something vibrating under the surface, a tension that no decor could disguise. She didn't glance at the cameras, though they were already red-dotted and hungry. She didn't even look at Tim Scott, who was sitting with that carefully rehearsed half-smile. She just walked to her seat like she'd been carrying this moment for years. Tim Scott adjusted his tie, pretending not to care. But everyone knew he did. His crypto empire, if you could call it that, had ballooned almost overnight, propped up by speculative hype and a parade of paid influencers. And when it started to unravel, he'd called it market volatility. When the lawsuits rolled in, he'd called it political persecution. But Jasmine had called it something else: fraud. The word still clung to the walls from the last time she said it. A low murmur spread through the press gallery as she flipped open her binder, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "Before we begin," she said, "I'd like to enter into the record the SEC's 243-page report, the testimonies of 19 former investors, and the forensic audit prepared last month." Tim's jaw flexed, just once. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You can spin numbers all you want," Jasmine continued, her eyes never leaving his, "but the math doesn't lie. Over 11,000 working-class Americans trusted you with their savings because you promised them a future. What they got was a black hole." Someone coughed near the back. The reporters started typing faster. She turned a page, the air seeming to tighten with every second. "Let's talk about the shell companies in the Cayman Islands," she said. "Or maybe the donor contributions that ended up in your personal accounts, laundered through digital tokens you swore were fully regulated." Tim tried to interject, "That's an outrageous." But Jasmine held up a hand. "You'll have your turn," she said quietly. "And when you do, I suggest you bring something more convincing than press releases and hashtags." She didn't shout. She didn't lean forward. But the way she said it, the calm precision of her voice, landed harder than any raised voice ever could. At that moment, the hearing wasn't about speculation anymore. It was about something much simpler, much deadlier to a public image: receipts. And Jasmine had them all. Tim Scott's fingers drummed the table, a quiet percussion of desperation disguised as confidence. Cameras zoomed in, hungry for a close-up of the man who'd convinced thousands of ordinary families to dump their life savings into a digital illusion. Jasmine didn't look at him as she set down another stack of documents, she looked at the people in the gallery. She wanted them to see her face when she said this next part. "Let's be clear," she began, her voice low but carrying. "You didn't just build a crypto empire. You built an empire on hope. You sold the American dream in digital coins and hashtags. And when it collapsed, you acted like you were the victim." Someone near the aisle swallowed hard. Even the congressional aides, usually experts at pretending they weren't listening, had stilled. Tim cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett, the volatility of any emerging market." She didn't blink. "Stop," she said simply. He froze, mid-sentence. Jasmine turned a page in her binder with the kind of deliberate calm that made people lean closer. "Do you know a woman named Sharon Ruiz?" she asked. He said nothing. "She's a retired nurse. 62 years old. She invested $38,000, her entire pension rollover, because she believed your pitch. You looked her in the eye on a televised town hall and said her grandkids would thank her someday." Tim's lips parted like he might try another defense, but nothing came out. Jasmine continued. "When your token value dropped 90% overnight, she called your office. You know what she was told? Still silence. That market setbacks are normal, and if she was patient, she'd see it rebound. Except it never did." She turned to the audience now, her words cutting through the stale air. "And Sharon wasn't alone. I have 113 letters here. Parents, veterans, small business owners, people who trusted your marketing more than their own instincts because you sounded so sure. A single camera light blinked red, broadcasting live. Millions were watching this unfold, seeing the split screen of a man in a tailored suit and a woman who refused to pretend this was just politics. "You want to call this a witch hunt?" Jasmine asked, her tone still soft. "Call it whatever you need to help you sleep. But the rest of us will call it what it is." She slid the final document across the table, her eyes locked on his. Accountability. And in that moment, Tim Scott finally looked like what he was, a man cornered by his own hubris. The next seconds were the kind of silence that feels heavier than any shouting match, because everyone in the room sensed what was happening. This wasn't just a takedown. It was a dismantling. Jasmine waited, letting the hush stretch long enough for every person watching, online, in newsrooms, in living rooms, to understand exactly why Tim Scott couldn't find his voice. Because the truth was bigger than his rehearsed lines. When he finally inhaled, it sounded ragged through the microphone. "Representative Crockett," he began, his tone pitched higher than before, "these were unprecedented market conditions. No one could have." "Don't," Jasmine cut in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The control in her tone was more powerful than any outburst. "We are not going to pretend this was random. You hired influencers. You promised historic returns. You even called it a guaranteed path to generational wealth." She turned to the chairman. "I'd like to enter into the record a series of campaign fundraising emails Mr. Scott sent during the peak of his cryptocurrencies promotion, soliciting donations with the promise of early access to token sales." The chairman nodded grimly. "So entered." A flicker of panic crossed Tim's face. It was gone in a blink, replaced by something colder, anger. "Are you suggesting my campaign and my business were in collusion?" Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. "I'm not suggesting it," she replied. "I'm proving it." She held up a glossy page, a screenshot of his campaign website from 8 months ago, the language unmistakable: "Join us in this movement and secure your exclusive stake in the fastest-growing crypto opportunity." And below it, the "Donate Now" button in bright red. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. On Twitter, news outlets were already clipping the moment, Jasmine's steady hand holding the printout, Tim's jaw tight with the realization he'd finally lost the narrative. "Let's stop pretending this was about innovation," Jasmine said quietly. "It was about greed. About convincing working Americans they could buy a shortcut to security, when all they were really doing was funding your next campaign and your next private plane." Tim shifted in his seat, but she didn't let him interrupt. "You want to talk about risk?" she asked. "Try being a single mom in Ohio who liquidated her 401k because she believed in your dream. Try explaining to her kids why they can't afford college now. That's risk." Her voice softened, but the edge never left. "You don't get to hide behind buzzwords anymore. The curtains pulled back. The empire is crumbling." She set the papers down with finality. And in that moment, there was no doubt, this wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning. The committee chamber had never felt so suffocating. Reporters shifted in their seats, torn between scribbling notes and just watching, because sometimes, you had to witness something firsthand to believe it was real. Tim Scott adjusted the knot of his tie, an old politician's reflex that usually bought him time. But today, it wasn't working. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't give him any space to spin. And that was what made this so devastating. "Congresswoman," Tim finally managed, voice rougher now, "I stand by my record of supporting innovation and economic opportunity. Yes, there were losses." She tilted her head slightly. "Losses? That's what we're calling it?" She picked up another document, this one a notarized affidavit from a former staffer who had handled investor complaints. "This isn't about market fluctuation," she continued. "It's about deception. You told retirees in Tennessee that your token was fully collateralized. You told a veterans group in Arizona that it was backed by federal grants. All lies." He tried to interrupt. She kept talking. "Do you know how many emails I've received from people whose lives you wrecked? A grandmother in Detroit who pawned her wedding ring to buy in. A teacher in El Paso who took out a loan. A small business owner in rural Georgia who trusted you. Her voice didn't crack. It never did. But the way she recited their stories carried a weight that made even the most hardened aides lower their eyes. And while they were scrambling to survive, Jasmine said, "You were buying beachfront property in the Carolinas." Gasps fluttered across the back rows. Tim swallowed hard. Those properties were purchased through fully legal. "Don't finish that sentence," she said evenly, and for a second, it was like the air got thinner. "Because the legality of your profit doesn't erase the immorality of your choices." A long pause. Long enough for the cameras to capture the precise moment Tim Scott understood this wasn't a skirmish. It was a demolition. Jasmine let the silence work for her. She didn't flinch. Didn't gloat. Just watched him with the calm of someone who knew she was speaking not only for herself but for thousands of people who never had the microphone. Then she leaned forward, her voice low but resonant enough to fill every corner of the chamber. "I'm going to say this plainly," she said. "Because sometimes the truth doesn't need decoration." She placed both palms on the table. "You didn't just fail your constituents. You exploited their hope." The committee chair shifted uncomfortably. Staffers exchanged wary glances. And Tim Scott, once the confident architect of a crypto empire, sat there in stunned quiet. Outside the hearing, the clip had already gone viral. Millions were watching. And for once, no one could look away. Tim Scott stared at the polished surface of the table like he was hoping it would open up and swallow him. But the table didn't budge. Neither did Jasmine. She picked up another document, this time, a spreadsheet with row after row of contributions, deposits, withdrawals. The numbers alone told a story uglier than any headline. "Let's talk about accountability," Jasmine began, her tone deceptively soft. "Because you've built a career preaching responsibility to everyone else. Single mothers. Public schools. Small business owners." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "But somehow, when it comes to your own ledger, responsibility gets a lot more optional." He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "I'm not finished." The hush was absolute. Even the security guards by the exits looked transfixed. "You took money from veterans who believed in you," she continued, voice steady. "From people who scraped together what little they had to buy a chance at something better. And when it collapsed, when their savings vanished, you blamed the market." She set the spreadsheet down with a quiet finality. "You didn't just gamble with their money," she said. "You gambled with their dignity." A tremor passed across Tim's jaw. "And I know what you're going to say," Jasmine went on, her gaze never wavering. "That you didn't force anyone to invest. That everyone made their own choice. And sure, maybe that's technically true." She leaned forward, her expression tightening. "But when you stand on a stage, with the US flag behind you and a title in front of your name, people trust you. That's what public service is supposed to mean. Not the chance to get rich while everyone else gets ruined." Someone in the gallery, maybe a laid-off miner, maybe a teacher, maybe just a citizen who'd had enough, let out a low exhale, like a balloon deflating. Tim rubbed a hand across his temple. It didn't make any difference. He still looked cornered. And Jasmine didn't ease up. "You want to talk about economic opportunity?" she asked, her voice cool. "How about you look the American people in the eye and admit you didn't just lose money, you destroyed lives?" She paused. "You say you believe in free markets," she continued, her tone dropping. "But I think you believe in free passes." The room felt smaller somehow, the walls inching closer. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might make this look less like a confession. But he had nothing. No polished line. No righteous indignation. Just the visible realization that for once, the spin cycle wasn't going to save him. Jasmine glanced around the room, her eyes sweeping over the aides, the lobbyists, the press. "That's why I'm here," she said softly, "to remind you that public office isn't a shield for your ambition. It's a responsibility. And you failed it." The silence that followed was the loudest sound in America. For the first time that morning, Tim Scott's voice cracked when he tried to speak. He caught it, barely, but the damage was done. "Congresswoman," he began, this is a gross mischaracterization." "Is it?" Jasmine's question cut in, clean and sharp. "Then explain this." She pulled out a letter, its edges creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. "This is from Sheila Martin in Omaha. She lost her entire pension fund in your crypto scheme." Jasmine read aloud, her voice steady even as the words drew a few gasps. "My husband died 2 years ago. I thought this investment would help me keep our home. Now I'm selling furniture to pay my property taxes." She folded the paper carefully and set it beside the spreadsheet. Tim swallowed. "I can't control every market fluctuation." "No," Jasmine agreed. "But you can control whether you promise guaranteed returns to people who don't have anything left to lose." Her voice dropped, low and deliberate. "You can control whether you cash out before the collapse." A few reporters exchanged looks. That detail hadn't been public, until now. Jasmine reached into her folder and produced the final document. A single page. A dated transaction record with Tim Scott's name on the transfer line. "You pulled your investment out 3 weeks before the market crashed," she said, each word measured. "And then you stood on a stage and told everyone else to hold the line." Tim's face turned a shade paler. "I had no knowledge." "No knowledge," Jasmine repeated. "Interesting. Because this timestamp shows your financial advisor emailed you exactly 24 hours before you moved that money." She set the page down like a verdict. "And you know what?" she added, her tone suddenly quiet, almost sorrowful. "I wish it weren't true. I wish this was just a smear campaign. But it's not. It's receipts." A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. The court of public opinion was already in session. Tim shifted in his seat, gripping the arms of the chair like they were the only solid thing left. Jasmine waited until the noise subsided before she spoke again. "This isn't about a market crash," she said. "It's about the way you exploited trust. The way you made desperation your business model." Her eyes narrowed. "And now you want to sit here and act like you're the victim of politics?" Her voice rose, not shouting, but filling every inch of the room. "People are sleeping in cars because you told them they were buying freedom," she said. "People are working 2 jobs because you told them they were investing in their kids' futures." She paused, letting the words fall like stones. "And you cashed out." Tim didn't try to speak again. There was nothing left to say. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his expression. The guilt. The fear. The realization that this was bigger than any talking point. Jasmine rested her hand flat on the table. "This is not going away," she said quietly. "You can spin it, deny it, bury it under press releases. But the truth has a way of surviving all that." Another silence descended, heavy and inescapable. The hush that followed Jasmine's final words was not the respectful quiet of routine hearings. It was the stunned, oxygenless pause that comes when the reality people have been avoiding finally enters the room. A young man sitting behind the cameras exhaled a shaky breath. He wasn't a reporter, just a junior staffer who'd come to take notes. He would later tell his friends he'd never seen someone dismantle a sitting senator's defense so thoroughly without raising her voice. Tim Scott didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on the papers Jasmine had laid out in front of him, the promise of prosperity, the evidence of betrayal, the timeline that no amount of PR could erase. One of the committee members shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared her throat as if to break the moment. But Jasmine didn't give them an exit. "You called it an opportunity," she said, voice calm, almost conversational. "An opportunity? For who?" She lifted her eyes to meet his. "Because for Sheila Martin in Omaha, it was the end of a lifetime of saving. For Carlos Mendez in Houston, it was the eviction notice he couldn't outrun. For thousands of others, it was the last bit of hope scraped out of a paycheck." Her hand hovered over the stack of evidence, but she didn't need to lift anything else. The point was already made. "You wrapped your scheme in the language of patriotism and innovation," she continued. "You told people they were part of something bigger. That they were finally taking back power." A bitter laugh slipped from her lips, and the microphones caught it, soft but unmistakable. "But the only person you empowered was yourself." Tim's jaw clenched. A flicker of anger tried to surface, but it had nowhere to go, not against facts laid bare. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her tone sharpening. "You want to call this political?" she asked. "Go ahead. Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight. But remember this, politics didn't empty those retirement accounts. Politics didn't transfer 7 figures out of your portfolio in the middle of the night." She paused. "You did." A few camera shutters clicked in rapid succession. The moment was now immortal, captured in pixels that would outlast every press statement. Jasmine reached for her folder again, but instead of more documents, she pulled out a handwritten letter. The paper was wrinkled, the ink smudged in places. "This was sent to my office last month," she said. "A grandmother from Akron who invested everything after seeing your ads." She said, "Tell him I believed." Her voice dropped so low the microphone barely picked it up. She said, "Tell him I believed." The word sat in the air, too heavy for anyone to dismiss. Tim finally lifted his head. His expression was blank, but his eyes betrayed him. He looked like a man who had run out of rehearsed lines. Jasmine folded the letter carefully, her hands steady. "You don't have to answer me today," she said quietly. "But you will answer to them." She gestured toward the cameras, toward the unseen millions who would soon be watching. "And when you try to rewrite this moment, remember that." Her gaze held his, unblinking. This wasn't theater. It wasn't politics. It was consequence. And every person in the room felt it. The hearing room didn't reset right away. Even as the chair tried to move the agenda forward, a tangible residue clung to the space, a sense that something irreversible had just happened. A few reporters were already tapping out headlines. "Crypto Empire crumbles," one draft read. "Jasmine Crockett draws a line in the sand." But the cameras didn't fully capture the small, telling details. Tim Scott's fingers tightening on the table's edge, the aides at the back exchanging panicked whispers, the way some of the committee members suddenly avoided eye contact. Jasmine wasn't interested in their discomfort. She was interested in clarity. She took a sip of water, set the glass down with deliberate calm, and continued. "Senator," she said, her voice steady, "let's set aside the spin. Let's talk about math." Tim Scott didn't respond. His silence wasn't the victorious quiet of a man above reproach, it was the shell of someone who had run out of excuses. Jasmine tapped a page in her binder, her tone growing sharper. "You promised a 40% return to investors in under 6 months, she reminded him. "You used your platform on national television, twice, to promote it. You funneled campaign donations into the same network of shell companies that were propping up your coin." Her eyes met his, unblinking. "You did this with the full knowledge that volatility was being manipulated by your partners. You knew the risk, and you pretended it didn't exist. And when the house of cards collapsed, you blamed the market instead of your own greed." A hush spread across the gallery, the kind that doesn't need amplification to feel thunderous. "And don't think," she added, her voice lowering to a near whisper, "that people didn't notice who got out with their money intact, while everyone else was left holding worthless digital tokens." Tim Scott shifted, finally lifting a hand as if to respond, but Jasmine didn't relent. "No," she said firmly. "You've had your press releases. Your statements. Your carefully worded denials. Today is for them." She gestured behind her, where dozens of victims sat. Some were retirees in plain jackets. A young couple clutched hands, their faces pale. An Iraq War veteran in a faded baseball cap stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight. "The people you called small investors," Jasmine said. "The ones you said would lift themselves up by believing in you. The ones who can't buy groceries now because their savings vanished overnight." Tim tried to interject. "With all due respect." But Jasmine raised her voice just enough to cut through the pretense. "Respect?" She tilted her head. "You don't get to invoke respect while pretending this was an honest mistake. You orchestrated this. You profited from this. And you expect the American people to forget because you have a title and a microphone." A rustle passed through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Tell him," just loud enough to carry. Jasmine drew in a breath, and her voice steadied again. "I'm not here to perform outrage. I'm here to remind you, and everyone watching, that no amount of power entitles you to immunity from consequence." Tim Scott looked away, his jaw tightening. "And if you think," she continued, "that you can rebuild your reputation with another media tour or another sanitized interview, you're underestimating the people you hurt." A beat of silence stretched between them, long enough that the cameras panned in tight on Jasmine's face. "Your crypto empire crumbled," she said quietly, "because it was never built on trust. It was built on hunger. On desperation. On the idea that no one would ever stand here and say, to your face, enough." Her hand flattened against the stack of evidence one last time. "Well," she finished, "consider this that moment." And no one, no aide, no senator, no strategist, dared interrupt her. If anyone in that hearing thought the moment would end with a dramatic flourish, they were wrong. Jasmine didn't slam her folder shut or point across the aisle. She simply let the silence breathe, let it wrap around the polished wood and sterile air until no one could pretend it wasn't real. Tim Scott tried to compose himself, but his face betrayed him, pinched around the eyes, tight at the corners of his mouth. The performance was over. And without the script, he looked like any man caught in the wreckage of his own making. The committee chair, normally eager to regain control, didn't interject. It was as if the whole panel knew that moving on too quickly would look obscene. Jasmine's gaze swept the gallery, landing on the faces of people who'd traveled hundreds of miles to be there. A woman in a red cardigan met her eyes, nodded once, and wiped at her cheek with the back of her hand. Jasmine inhaled, steadying her voice. "I'm not naive," she said, tone softer but edged with resolve. "I know how these hearings usually go. A few headlines. A press statement or two. A committee vote that gets buried under next week's news cycle." Her eyes flicked to Tim again. "But here's what I also know, moments like this don't just disappear. They live in the record. They live in the memories of everyone who was deceived. And they live in the questions your children will one day ask about what you did when you had a choice." A chill moved through the room, subtle, but unmistakable. Tim finally found his voice, a rasp of strained control. "You're making this personal," he said, his gaze hard. Jasmine didn't blink. "It is personal," she answered. "Because the damage you did wasn't abstract. It didn't happen in spreadsheets or quarterly reports. It happened in kitchens and bank accounts and hospital waiting rooms." She held up the letter again, the grandmother's handwriting visible even from a distance. "It happened to her," she said, her voice quiet but carrying. "And to thousands like her. And you don't get to dismiss it as politics. Not anymore." A reporter in the corner was typing furiously. Another was filming on a phone, too invested to worry about decorum. Jasmine set the letter down with deliberate care. Senator Scott, you can spend the rest of your term trying to rewrite this story, she continued. But you will never rewrite this day. Tim's hand twitched as if he might say more, but he didn't. He just sat there, a man surrounded by cameras and colleagues but more alone than he had ever been. Jasmine drew in a measured breath. To everyone watching, she said, now speaking directly to the gallery, and to the millions who would see the footage before midnight, I want you to remember this: you are not stupid for believing. You are not weak for hoping. You are only human. Her voice softened. And the people who exploit that humanity, who see it as an easy mark to be monetized, are the ones who should be ashamed. No one dared move. Jasmine's tone hardened again, final and unflinching. You called it a revolution, she said, her eyes locked on Tim. But all you really built was a scam with better branding. And today, it ends. She let the last word hang in the air, an unspoken declaration. And this time, when the chair cleared his throat, he sounded almost relieved to have something to do. Representative Crockett, thank you, he murmured. But everyone knew the truth. She wasn't finished yet. The cameras were still rolling when Jasmine slowly gathered her papers. She didn't look hurried or triumphant. She looked like a woman who had carried something heavy for too long, and finally set it down in public. A junior staffer tried to hand her another binder. She waved it away with a small shake of her head. She'd said what needed to be said. More words wouldn't make the truth any clearer. Across from her, Tim Scott was motionless, staring down at his hands like he was seeing them for the first time. He looked older, smaller. Not because Jasmine had humiliated him with insults, but because she hadn't needed to. She'd used receipts, facts, names. And the hollow scaffolding of his defense had collapsed all on its own. Aides were already hustling to spin it, frantic texts, phone calls to friendly outlets, a draft statement about unfortunate misunderstandings. But everyone in that chamber knew, no statement could erase the footage of him shrinking in his chair while she stood steady. The chair finally declared a recess. A soft buzz rolled through the room, but no one rose right away. The audience stayed glued to their seats, still processing the collision they'd witnessed. Jasmine turned to leave, but then she stopped, her voice cutting through the murmurs one last time. Before I go, she said evenly, I want to leave you with something. She lifted a thin folder, one she hadn't opened yet. These are the stories of ordinary people who lost everything in that crypto scheme, she continued, her tone unwavering. I'm submitting them to the record because they deserve more than a footnote in your legacy. Tim didn't look up. He just stared at the folder like it was radioactive. I don't care, Jasmine added, if you never apologize. I don't care if you spend the rest of your career pretending this was all just politics. But know this, the rest of us saw you. And we won't forget. She closed the folder and set it gently on the table between them. For everyone watching at home, she said, her voice warming, I know what it feels like to put your faith in someone and be betrayed. I know what it costs to believe in something that crumbles in your hands. But your faith wasn't the mistake. She looked out across the gallery, meeting as many eyes as she could. The mistake was theirs, she said simply. And the shame belongs to them. A hush settled, heavier than before. It was the quiet of clarity, of people realizing they'd witnessed something they couldn't unsee. And then Jasmine turned and walked away, not pausing to collect congratulations or glances. She didn't need any of it. The clip went viral before she even reached her car. Within an hour, 1,000 versions of the moment were circulating online, some spliced into reels, others captioned with bold declarations. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't let him off the hook. By nightfall, the hashtag #CryptoEmpireCrumble was the top trend in America. But Jasmine didn't check it. She was already on a call with her team, outlining proposals to tighten fraud enforcement, to strengthen oversight, to make sure no other scheme like this slipped through. Because she knew the point wasn't just to expose corruption, it was to prove there was still something worth believing in when the cameras shut off. And in that, she'd done more than win a hearing. She'd reminded everyone that sometimes the loudest accountability comes without a single raised voice. Thank you for staying with us until the very last word. If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry, or hopeful, or simply more awake, share it. Talk about it. Because moments like these don't belong to any one person. They belong to all of us. And when we remember them together, it's harder for the powerful to pretend they never happened. If you're ready for more stories that refuse to look away, you know what to do: subscribe, follow, and stay with us. Because we're just getting started.